Hi, One Lit Teacher here. Today I'm going to talk about a metaphysical poem by John Donne called The Flea. This poem's always a little bit awkward to discuss because while it is a great example of metaphysical poetry and a true work of art, it is about a sexual proposition. So we'll talk about it a little bit delicately. This poem is a rakish poem by John Donne, and what I mean by that is that Donne wrote the poem in a period during his lifetime when he was a young man about town, and he was quite the womanizer, so you're going to find the poem pretty misogynistic. However, it's also a humorous poem, and if you study the poetry of John Donne as a body of work, you'll find that there is great growth in his maturity between this poem and other poems like The Good Morrow or a valediction forbidding mourning, for example. And so it's sort of a nice, fulfilling opportunity to see this man sort of biographically unfold through his poetry. This poem has a pretty typical stanza structure for Donne. It is set up in 3 stanzas, and Donne likes this structure, and I think it actually could tie into his use of the Trinity. There is a use of religion in the poem where he fuses sort of physical and abstract or spiritual ideas and also turns conventional ideas like religion around and uses them in a way that some people at the time and maybe even today might consider blasphemous. But 3 is an important number in the poem. It is not only 3 stanzas, but there are 3 characters in this poem. A man, a woman whom he is courting and is alone with, which would be unusual for an unmarried couple in this time, and also a flea, which might sound sort of strange to you and perhaps even horrifying. But at the time, fleas were pretty commonly found on people. So remember that this is the Renaissance period coming out of medieval times. People didn't really bathe very much. They had heavy tapestries in their homes, and they kept pets and sometimes even livestock in lean-tos attached to their homes and that sort of thing. So finding a flea on your intended lover was not unusual and would not be a deal breaker at the time. The poem is also set up in 3 stages of narrative. So each stanza has a part in the storyline, so to speak, of the poem. The rhyme scheme is AABBCCDDD, and I believe that even that rhyme scheme goes into Donne's use of number motif and his sort of elaborate thinking. So we have couplet, 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 triplet, and that each one of those structures makes up one stanza, which unifies the poem. And that goes along with the argument about the 3 characters sort of becoming one inside the flea, and it's part of his whole proposition argument. It is an elaborate argument built on a conceit. This conceit, of course, is also a microcosm, and that means that it's a tiny version of the universe, or in this case of the relationship that Donne is arguing for. The conceit is that this flea has already bitten the man, and it has already bitten the woman, and so their blood is mingling inside the flea, and so they've already consummated the relationship in a way, and so why not just go all the way and really consummate it? It won't hurt any more than that little flea bite. And I should mention that during this time, scientific and medical knowledge was sort of limited and archaic, and the mingling of bloods was sort of the way that they thought about sex and procreation at the time. The poem does contain a lot of typical metaphysical elements, and if you would like a little more background on what that means, I do have a video on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, about metaphysical poetry. But one of the cornerstone attributes is the conceit, which we've already discussed, as well as the microcosm and the use of arguments. This one also is an extended apostrophe, which is sort of a typical Donne technique or Donne convention in which he seems to be talking to this woman who is there, but she doesn't respond. Donne uses a lot of the typical metaphysical conventions and then also has some of his own hallmark conventions that may not be found so much in the poems of other poets. Who are considered metaphysical poets. A few vocabulary words in this poem. Maidenhead in line 6 means virginity. So when he says, "Thou knowest this cannot be said, a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead," He's arguing that she doesn't need to worry about that typical concern of the day, losing her maidenhead or her virginity to this man, even though she's unmarried. Cloistered in line 15 means sheltered or secluded, as if inside a cloister or a convent. So that's part of that religious diction and religious imagery coming in the poem. Jet is a pun in line 15. It is the color black, the color of this flea, but it also is a forceful stream, which goes along with the suggestive element of the poem, the sexual proposition idea of the poem. This jet, of course, having to do with the sex act and tying in with the idea of petite mort, a little death, that if she has sex with him, it will kill him, but only for a period of time. In line 18, sacrilege is a sin against the church or against what is sacred. But again, John Donne is turning around what is sacred and what might be acceptable in his own little sort of religion of love, which is an idea that he brings in some of his other poetry. So here I've marked some of the structural elements of the poem. The poem, again, is in 3 stanzas, which reinforces a trinity idea that Donne likes to use in a lot of his poetry. It is mixed meter, although primarily iambic tetrameter and iambic pentameter. It has some change-ups in stanzas 1 and 3. So on the first stanza, I have marked the meter throughout, and I've put some little numbers to the left, and that shows you the first line is tetrameter, the second line is pentameter, and it shows you the alternating pattern, and then the last 2 lines are both pentameter. But what I want to draw your attention to is that Donne uses the trochaic foot at the beginning of the first 2 stanzas to get the listener's attention, or in this case, the sort of pretend lady's attention. Mark, but this flea, and mark in this, or oh stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare. It really wouldn't read properly if those were iambic feet necessarily, and I think that this goes along with his argument idea. Also, he's using caesuras there at the beginning of stanza 2, oh stay, where there's this pause in the line, and then just before it, and this, alas, is more than we would do. This is a dramatic moment where he creates a pause for us to sort of get the impact. The punctuation in the poem is significant. You might notice that there are quite a few run-on lines where there's enjambment in the first 2 stanzas. But by the time we get to the 3rd stanza, where the lady has already squashed the flea and the poet could give up, he instead uses some rhetorical questions to help him turn the argument around here. So this is an outlandish metaphor. It is more startling than just a regular conceit or an extended metaphor in other poetry. And again, if you need some help with metaphysical conceits, I have a video on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, about metaphysical conceits. It is a complex, intricate comparison used as an intellectual device, and it helps to integrate the physical sensory with the abstract spiritual. So again, he wants to have sex with this woman, but he's bringing in these spiritual elements like religion and turning them around. The conceit, again, is the hallmark of metaphysical poetry. This poem also involves a microcosm, again, micro, mini, cosm, universe, a tiny universe in which nothing else matters but the woman himself and the flea and the goal that he has in mind here, which is to have sex with the woman. The poem is a syllogism of sorts. A syllogism is an argument that is drawn from 2 premises which share a term with the conclusion. So the flea has, he says, harmlessly sucked us both and now enjoys itself swollen within with our mingled blood inside of it. And the flea is now you and I, already married, our marriage bed and marriage temple, and no harm has come of this. So if this flea is us and our relationship has already been consummated and enjoyed in this harmless flea, then yielding to me will also be harmless and enjoyable. What's particularly humorous about the poem to me is that Donne loses the argument because at the beginning of the 3rd stanza, we see that she has already purpled her nail with the blood of innocence, with this flea's blood. And then instead of giving up, Donne flips the argument to say, well, if you feel triumphant now, just imagine how triumphant you'll feel then if you yield to me. Is it really a sexual proposition? Well, absolutely. You can see it when you start to look at the color marking. So repetition, sucks, is a very important word in this poem, all over the poem. Married, again, sort of mixing the religious idea of being married with the proposition here. There is a religious motif with words like shame and words like innocence and nail, sins and so on, where he's sort of twisting religion to sort of fit his needs here. The argument diction comes in right at the beginning with the repetition of the word mark in the first line, and then words like alas at the caesura and let not, 'tis true, false, just so, and so on, that help us to see that he's building the argument on the idea of sexual proposition. Again, the number motif is really interesting. He uses 1, 2, and 3 to sort of circle back to the idea of one. Okay, we could become a union of two inside the flea, which is the third member, and then be one, a unified couple. There is a lot of suggestive diction in the poem. Again, sucks, pampered swells, let you do with that what you'd like. Again, the repetition of sucks and yield and so on. A pun in the poem here, again, is the living walls of jet, which is also part of the suggestive idea. And though you make you apt to kill me, again, is that idea of petite mort, this sexual experience in which someone is sort of pseudo-killed and then can live to rise again, live on. There are some opposites in the poem that build with the argument, such as living and dead, innocence and guilt, triumph and weakness, false and true, and so on, which Donne uses to help turn things around to his benefit. And a unity motif with words like, or phrases like, mingled be, one blood made of two, more than married are, marriage bed, marriage temple, yield to me. So yes, this is a very complex sexual proposition. The theme is carpe diem, seize the day, and he wants to seize it in a very particular way because, again, this is a rakish poem. Before I conclude, I'll just talk briefly about sound devices because I always want to encourage my students to look at them before they're finished with the poem. If they don't jump right out at you at the beginning, then they may just be subtly used to bring it all together. So, for example, I have marked the W's, we would do, we were, and the S's, sacrilege, sins, that just sort of help the poem to sort of meld together and flow. I think the most important alliteration is in the end, where he's really trying to make his point. 'Tis true, false fears, will waste, to really sort of drive it home at the end. And the assonance, perhaps not quite as important, but if you look at it in the last few lines, that E sound, which is also part of the rhyme scheme, but also becomes part of an internal rhyme towards the end, me be three, but then in the last stanza, thee, me, be, flee, thee, kind of supports the argument of their unifying together inside this microcosm, this flea. So who thinks fleas are romantic? Well, it's a joke, but going back to ancient Greek times, poets have made jokes about the fact that fleas get to do things that humans don't necessarily get to do. The tone of the poem is very persuasive, but it's also humorous because this is probably a poem that Donne wrote to be passed around at the pub among his friends and sort of impress them with his, what we might call today, locker room humor. So the audience, I think, is Donne's friends rather than truly the woman to whom he seems to be speaking inside the poem. It's an important poem, again, because it's an excellent example of metaphysical poetry, and because if you study the poetry of John Donne, you'll see that development from this rakish, very arrogant young man into a man who truly knows what love is by the time that he has married Anne More, and certainly in the poems that he's written after her death, and also in the poems and sermons that he writes when he's a minister towards the end of his life. You see a totally different John Donne. It's almost like three different people. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher.